Hello everybody, welcome back to Tech Tuesday. Today we will be answering the question, how and why do I set up my suspension sag? Following that question, you might have a few others come to mind, such as, don't I need a university degree to do that? And the answer is no, it's quite simple. Another question is possibly, J-Dog, why on earth should I care about my suspension sag? And I would say to that, provided you have a bike with any kind of suspension, your bike suspension has been designed to give you traction when traveling over terrain and allow you to travel more efficiently over that terrain. If you disregard your suspension setup, you're going to lack in these departments. You might be wallowing or bottoming out or failing to generate any traction at all and riding a pogo stick around. The third question, which I hope you have asked by now, is, J-Dog, how do I set up my suspension sag? And that is what we're going to take a look at right now. What is suspension sag? That's essentially how much the bike will compress into its travel with just your rider weight on it. This is a factor of the amount of support that your suspension can give. If you're running higher pressures in your air suspension, it's going to mean less sag and more support. Makes sense? And the converse will be true for lower pressures. You're going to have more sag and less support. There are negative effects to either side of these, so it's important that you try and find the right balance between support and traction. If those pressures are too high, your bike isn't going to be able to compress the suspension effectively, you're not going to gain a lot of traction, and you might find that the bike bobs around a lot on the climbs. And if you don't have enough support, if your sag is too much, you're not running high enough pressures in your suspension, you're probably going to find you're bottoming out quite a bit, the bike's wallowing on the climb. I've seen people trying to ride up hills with their sag at around about 90%. It's like you're riding up two hills, not recommended at all. Important to remember when setting up the sag on your suspension is to always use the same method and ideally the same shock pump. This is so you have consistency when setting it up. You want to try and find flat ground such as a parking lot or maybe your driveway to do it on. Then you also want to set it up for your riding weight. So if you ride typically with a heavy backpack on, set up your sag while you have a heavy backpack on. If you typically ride naked, set up your sag while you're naked. This is the baseline setup for your suspension. It's the right place to start when trying to set up your suspension, and it's always something that you'll come back to as the days roll on. When you're going to set up the sag for your suspension, you'll like to check the recommended settings that your bike will either have printed on the frame or on the manufacturer's website. If there aren't any, you just start with 2 times your kilogram body weight and translate that into PSI for the rear shock, that is. So for myself, at 80 kilograms, I'll start with 160 PSI in the rear shock. And this is a baseline that I'll then work up or down from depending on how the bike feels. Fork setup by sag is becoming less and less popular, as a lot of forks have a recommended pressures printed on the fork, which you can set up with and then work from there depending on the feel, whether you feel like you need more support or less support. So we won't talk about sag setup on the fork, only the rear shock. So once you have your flat ground, your shock pump, your riding weight, your bicycle, you'll want to set the sag. Pump up the shock to the pressure that you've calculated, either through the recommended settings or by your weight calculation. You'll then want to climb onto the bike, settle in very gently into the sag point of the suspension, letting it settle down there, and then climb off the bike very gently, trying not to compress it any further than just your weight sitting on the bike is. From there, have a look at where the O-ring is sitting on the shock. If you have rock shock suspension, there are probably percentage indicators which are very helpful to let you work out what percentage sag you're running. If not, you'll have to do a little bit of math, measure the compressed stroke, and then divide that by the total stroke times by 100 to give you the percentage sag that you need. Your enduro or trail bike should be sitting at around 30% sag, while your marathon bike is probably going to be in the 20 to 25% range. On a bike such as the GT Sensor I have here, the recommended sag is not a percentage, it is a measurement, and that can make it a little bit easier in that sense if you don't have shock markers on there. If you find that the bike is not hitting that sweet spot of the manufacturer's recommended settings or the percentages I mentioned earlier with your initial air pressure setup, then you can try add a bit of air if it's sagging too much, or reducing the air if it is not sagging enough. Do this in 5 or 10 PSI increments. It is now important that you record on your notes app or a piece of paper your initial suspension setup, the pressure and the sag that it's running, so that you can always go back to that if you feel you need to change it. Remember that is just for the initial setup. Once you have that first sag number, you can then go out and ride your bike and work out from there whether you feel like you're going to be needing more support from your suspension or less support. I hope this has been helpful and possibly even revolutionary for your riding experience. If you follow those steps, you should end up with a really decent baseline setting. There are of course a lot more tweaks and adjustments that you can make from there, but for today we'll leave it at that. Cheers for now.